The weaponization of migration. How countries win wars without firing a shot. What if I told you one of the most powerful weapons in modern war isn't a missile or a tank, but people? How are countries learning to use desperate men, women, and children to destabilize their enemies and win wars without ever firing a shot? This isn't some dystopian fantasy. It's a very real, invisible form of warfare, creating chaos from the forests of Eastern Europe to the southern US border. On this new battlefield, human lives are the ammunition, and the goal is to fracture a society from the inside out. Today, we're exposing how this disturbing strategy works, who's pulling the strings, and what it means for the future of war itself. To get a handle on this new type of conflict, we need to define it. Experts call it the weaponization of migration. It's the intentional use of large-scale migration by one country to blackmail, intimidate, or destabilize another. This isn't just a consequence of war, it is the war, fought with human desperation. This tactic is a key part of what military strategists call hybrid warfare, a sophisticated mix of conventional and unconventional moves. Instead of just soldiers and bombs, hybrid warfare uses a whole toolbox: cyber attacks that shut down infrastructure, disinformation campaigns that fuel social division, economic pressure that chokes a nation's finances, and now, engineered migration crises. So, why is this so devastatingly effective? Because it strikes at the very heart of democratic societies, targeting their values and vulnerabilities. Open societies are built on laws, human rights, and a moral duty to help those in need. Weaponized migration exploits these principles. It forces an impossible choice on the target country: either take in a massive, unplanned wave of people, which strains social services and infrastructure, or lock down the borders and get branded as inhumane violators of international law. Either path leads to political chaos. An influx of migrants can ignite anti-immigrant sentiment and empower nationalist movements, creating deep fractures within the country. At the same time, images of violent pushbacks and suffering at the border tank a nation's reputation on the world stage. The aggressor state just sits back and watches its enemy tear itself apart, all without deploying a single soldier on its soil. While this strategy feels terrifyingly new, it's got history. During the Cold War, Cuba and Vietnam used refugee flows to put pressure on the United States. In the 90s, forced displacement was a central tool in the Balkan Wars, used to redraw the map demographically. And for years, Libyan dictator Muammar Gaddafi famously threatened to turn Europe black by unleashing waves of African migrants if the EU didn't cough up cash and political concessions. But what we're seeing today is different. This isn't just a threat. It's a calculated, well-oiled machine of state-sponsored human trafficking run with chilling precision. Nothing illustrates this new warfare quite like the crisis that blew up on the border between Belarus and the European Union in 2021. It was, and still is, a masterclass in weaponized migration. This crisis didn't just happen, it was manufactured. It all started when the EU slapped sanctions on Belarus and its authoritarian president, Alexander Lukashenko, for brutally crushing pro-democracy protests. In revenge, Lukashenko decided to hit the EU where it was most vulnerable. He couldn't win a military fight, but he knew he could create a crisis that would strain the bloc's unity and test its moral compass. Here's how the machine worked. First, the Belarusian government basically turned into a state-run travel agency for migrants. It loosened visa rules for people from countries in the Middle East and Africa. State-linked tourism companies started selling all-inclusive packages: a flight to Minsk, a hotel, and then a guided trip to the EU border. People desperate for a better life paid thousands, thinking they were getting a legitimate ticket to Europe. Once in Minsk, they were bused to the borders of Poland, Lithuania, and Latvia. There, armed and uniformed Belarusian border guards took over. Instead of guarding the border, their job was to break it. They gave migrants wire cutters to get through fences, used shields to protect them from Polish water cannons, and physically forced them across the line, sometimes at gunpoint. The result was pure chaos. The EU was plunged into a political crisis. Poland and the Baltic states declared states of emergency, sending troops to the border and building fortified walls. This created a brutal political catch-22. Should they follow EU law and honor the right to asylum, or treat this as a hybrid attack and respond with force? The crisis was engineered to create exactly this division, turning EU members against each other. But the most devastating toll was on the people used as weapons. Thousands of men, women, and children were trapped in a frozen no-man's land. They were stuck in the dense, freezing forest between Belarus and Poland with no food, shelter, or way to go forward or back. They were shoved into Poland by Belarusian guards and then violently pushed back into Belarus by Polish guards. The humanitarian crisis was catastrophic, with many dying from hypothermia and exhaustion. These weren't migrants in the usual sense, they were human ammunition, fired in a sick geopolitical game. The fallout from this continues. In May 2025, Lithuania took a landmark step, filing a case against Belarus at the International Court of Justice, aiming to hold the regime legally accountable for orchestrating this human smuggling operation. It's a critical first move in trying to build a defense against a type of war where the law itself is a primary target. The Belarus crisis wasn't a one-off. It was a test run, and its methods were watched closely by Belarus's biggest ally, Russia. By 2023, intelligence reports showed that Russia wasn't just backing Belarus's play, but was actively adopting and scaling it up. According to reports, Russia began setting up its own irregular migration routes, flying people from various countries to Moscow before funneling them toward the Belarusian border and onto the EU. This turned the crisis from a localized tantrum by a rogue state into a sustained, strategic campaign by a global power. For Russia, this is about more than just getting back at the EU for sanctions. It's a key piece of its long-running hybrid war against the West. The goal is to create constant, low-grade chaos on the EU's eastern flank, forcing member states to pour resources and attention into border security. It exploits the deep political divisions over migration in Europe, knowing it's a hot-button issue that can paralyze governments. By keeping this pressure up, Russia aims to distract, divide, and exhaust its opponents. Every news cycle filled with border clashes, every political shouting match over fences and asylum, is a small win. It burns political capital, erodes social trust, and serves as a smokescreen for other Russian aggressions. Weaponized migration is now a permanent part of Russia's foreign policy, a cheap and effective way to wage a quiet war of attrition against Europe. While Belarus and Russia use migration as an offensive weapon, another power has perfected the art of using it for blackmail: Turkey. Turkey's geography makes it a natural gatekeeper between the Middle East and Europe. For years, it has hosted one of the world's largest refugee populations, a direct result of the Syrian civil war. And it has learned how to turn this humanitarian burden into a powerful political weapon. The dynamic is brutally simple. On multiple occasions, Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan has threatened to open the gates and let millions of refugees pour into Europe. This isn't an empty threat. It's a powerful bargaining chip used to squeeze concessions from the European Union. Whether Turkey wants financial aid for refugees, political cover for its military actions in Syria, or for the EU to look the other way on its domestic policies, the threat of a migration crisis is its ace in the hole. We saw a stark example in early 2020. After taking losses in clashes with Syrian forces, Turkey demanded more support from NATO and the EU. When it didn't come fast enough, Turkey made good on its threat. It announced its borders were open and started busing thousands of migrants to the Greek border. The scenes were shocking. Desperate people clashing with Greek riot police, tear gas in the air, and a humanitarian crisis manufactured overnight. And the tactic worked. The EU, terrified of another 2015-style migrant crisis, rushed to the negotiating table. The result was the EU-Turkey migration deal, a complex agreement where the EU gave billions in aid and made political concessions. In return, Turkey promised to once again secure its borders. But this reliance on Turkey has a price. It has made the EU dependent on an increasingly authoritarian leader for its border security. It has also prompted Europe to militarize its own borders. Greece, with EU funds, has built up its border wall and rolled out advanced surveillance tech. In a way, Turkey's strategy has forced Europe to become more of a fortress, fundamentally changing its stance on migration and asylum. It proves that even the threat of weaponized migration can be as powerful as the act itself. This isn't just a European issue. The same playbook is now running in America's backyard. In recent years, U.S.-Nicaragua relations have soured, especially after the sham 2021 election that cemented Daniel Ortega's authoritarian grip. In response to U.S. sanctions, the Ortega regime has deployed a weapon of its own. Nicaragua has weaponized its migration policies in a classic case of asymmetric warfare, where a weaker state uses unconventional tactics to hit a stronger adversary where it hurts. Specifically, the Ortega regime started chartering flights and dropping visa requirements for people from countries like Cuba and Haiti. This move created a new, state-sanctioned superhighway for migrants heading north. By making it easy to get to Managua, Nicaragua essentially offers a launch pad to the U.S. border, piling onto the immense logistical and political pressure that already exists there. Since 2023, the U.S. has responded by imposing visa restrictions on the owners and executives of charter companies that facilitate this pipeline. For the Ortega regime, the math is cynical but simple. It's a cheap way to hit back at the United States. It creates major problems for U.S. border control, pours gasoline on fiery political debates inside America, and forces the U.S. to burn diplomatic and financial resources to manage the flow. It's a perfect example of how even a small, isolated country can use human mobility as a foreign policy tool, turning desperate people into leverage against a superpower. The stories of Belarus, Russia, Turkey, and Nicaragua aren't just isolated incidents. They're data points in a terrifying new trend. The weaponization of migration is fast becoming a standard part of 21st century statecraft, with profound consequences. First, there's the political fallout. These engineered crises are tailor-made to cause maximum social and political chaos. The sudden arrival of large groups of migrants, framed as a hostile invasion, gives ammunition to nationalist and far-right movements. This tactic also brilliantly exposes and deepens policy cracks within alliances. The EU, for example, has been repeatedly paralyzed by infighting over how to respond, undermining the very unity it was built on. The aggressor state wins by weakening its enemy from within, without firing a shot. Then, there is the devastating human cost. We have to remember that the migrants in these crises are not soldiers. They aren't invaders. They are human beings, often families fleeing war and poverty, who are being cruelly used as pawns in a game they never agreed to play. Lured by false promises, they are met with violence and exploitation. The response has been the rise of militarized borders. More walls, more drones, more violent pushbacks. The victims are trapped, abused by the states pushing them forward and rejected by the states they hope to reach. Finally, this trend signals a dark turn in global affairs. The rise of what some analysts call geocriminality. This is where the line between statecraft and organized crime gets blurry. To run these campaigns, states like Belarus have been shown to work with or act like human smuggling networks. They are essentially adopting the business model of organized crime and using it as an instrument of state power. This is a dangerous new world where the laws and norms that are supposed to govern how countries behave are being systematically torn down. The weaponization of migration isn't a future threat. It's here, now. It's a calculated, effective, and increasingly popular tool of modern conflict. We've seen how Belarus cooked up a crisis from scratch, how Russia folded it into its hybrid war strategy, how Turkey uses it for blackmail, and how Nicaragua uses it as an asymmetric weapon. In every case, the goal is the same: to win a political fight by turning human desperation into a weapon. If you found this breakdown valuable, be sure to subscribe and ring that bell so you don't miss our next deep dive into the hidden forces shaping our world. And we want to hear from you. Drop a comment below. What's the best way for democracies to fight back against this new form of warfare without giving up their humanitarian values? Looking ahead, the challenge only gets tougher. Borders are now battlefields, and desperate people have become ammunition. It forces us to ask a deeply uncomfortable question. Are we ready for a world where wars are won not by armies leveling cities, but by enemies exploiting the very compassion and rule of law our societies are built on?